Hello ladies and gentlemen, in this video I'm going to show you how I make a brand new Expo project with Firebase. First thing you need to do is pick a folder that you're going to use to store your project in. I'm going to use the demo projects folder on my desktop here. Then go into Expo XDE and click the create new project button. Now I always do a tab navigation project even if I don't want tab navigation because it gives you a lot of stuff that you can just delete out if you don't want. And I think that's easier than adding a bunch of stuff that you need to the blank project. So I'm going to name my project something. This will be called Expo Firebase Starter. And I'll choose the folder that I mentioned earlier, demo projects folder on my desktop. Then click create. Now this usually takes about 10 minutes, so I will pause the video and resume when this is finished. Okay, so the project has finished setting up and it actually went a lot faster than I expected. Now the first thing I recommend doing anytime you create a new project is running it before you make any changes, just to make sure everything's running properly. As you can see, I've got it running over here on the iOS simulator, which you can get to by clicking device and opening it up in one of the simulators. You can also use the share button to open it up in the Expo app if you prefer that. So like I said, this is going to be a Firebase project, so the first thing we'll do is install Firebase into the project, and the way that you do that is open up a terminal into the project, and an easy way to do that is to click project and open in terminal. That'll give you a terminal window at the project's location, and to install Firebase you type npm install -S for save Firebase, and that will take a couple of minutes to install. So while that's going, I'll show you a few other things that I like to do when I create a new project. First thing we're going to do is open it up in a text editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code. Choose the folder right here. And we're going to delete a whole bunch of things out that aren't needed at the moment. So the first thing I do is I go into navigation, open up the main tab navigator, and delete the links and settings tabs. So delete references there, there are the files right there. And then down here, this code picks the icon out for it, but we won't need that, so I'll delete all of that. And I'll save it. You can see that in the simulator on the right, it's updating as I click save. Those tabs are gone. We can also delete the files themselves. So let's get rid of those. And I usually keep the home screen, but I rename it to test screen. So I'm going to rename this to test screen, and I'll explain why in a second. So anywhere I see test screen, I'm going to rename it to test. That's these places. This is in the main tab navigator, like I said. We also need to rename the file to testscreen.js, and within here we should rename the class. And there's an error because we didn't save this yet. All right, it couldn't find the file because it was renamed. All right, now what I usually do on the test screen is I clear out everything, and I just use this screen as a scratch pad. Anytime I want to test anything out, I just throw it in the test screen. So we will delete all of these functions here, and I'll clear out the render function, and it's just gonna, for now, we'll just put some text that says hello, just to make sure it's displaying something. Save it, and there's hello. It's a little bit hard to see, so I'm going to put a view here with some padding so it's not covered up by the top menu. And we can also delete a few other things out here that we don't need to clean this up a little bit. One second. Okay. And we don't need any of these styles either, so we'll delete all of those. Okay, and you can see over here it says hello, just like we wanted it to. You can check on Firebase installation. Looks like it installed successfully. So that's good to go. All right, I'm going kind of through the screens from bottom to top. Or the folders, I mean. So we did the screens, we renamed home to test screen, we deleted some stuff out of navigation and constants. I don't usually use this layout, so I'll delete that. And I do want to add a new file in our constants called API keys. And this is going to store all of our API keys. Like I said, we're using Firebase, so we'll also put the Firebase config in there. And it's nice to have all your API keys into one file that you can reference as you need them. So in here we'll put export default, and we'll just put Firebase config. And we'll make that empty for now, but I'll show you what we're going to put into it later. All right, so save that. The next thing I like to do is in the components, first of all, delete that. And then I create a folder that I call app components. And this is where I'm going to put all the components that are specific to this app. And inside of that folder, I'll create a file called index.js. And we'll create one more file called test_component.js. And this is just going to be a test component that we'll throw on our test screen to make sure it works. So let's write something, import React from React, and import view and text from React Native, export default class, test component, extends react.component, and we'll give it a render method. It'll just be text test component. Okay, so that's a really basic React Native component, and then we'll go into index, and what I do here is I import it. So import test component from test component, and then I export that test component. The reason I do this is because you can have one file with all of your components, and then you don't need to, if you have subfolders within here, you don't need to remember all the paths and make sure that that's all referenced correctly. You just reference this one file and you have your component. I'll show you how that works on our test screen. So we go over to test screen and we'll say import test component from ... to go up one level, components, app components, and then we will reference it down here, test component, and if it appears over here, it means everything worked, which there it is. Okay. So we know that this infrastructure is working well. We can delete test component later and put all of our real components in there as we need them. In the assets folder, I usually keep that the same. It's got some default images that we'll delete eventually, but for now it's nice to have them in there, and nothing in API for the moment. Okay, as I said, this is a Firebase project. We've already installed Firebase. Now we need to go into Firebase and create a project and get our configuration info. So you can do that by going to firebase.google.com, creating a new project. I won't go through all of that, but then what you need to do is click Add Firebase to your web app. And when you click that, it will give you a little bit of code that you can add with configuration info for Firebase. What we're going to do is copy that code and put it into our constants/API keys file in this Firebase config. So you'll just replace this with whatever that configuration is that they give you. It should contain things like API key, auth domain, database URL, and a few other things. So whatever that is for your project, you'll put that here, and you'll be able to reference it later on when we start using Firebase in our code. The last thing you need to do to get Firebase enabled for your app is to initialize Firebase, which I do in app.js. In order to initialize it, we'll need our Firebase config that we added to API keys. So we will import API keys from constants/API keys. And you'll also need to import the Firebase library, which you do by typing import star as Firebase from Firebase. The place where I personally initialize Firebase is in the constructor, so I will create a constructor here. You're required to call super props, and I'll move this state into the constructor because that's what I personally like to do. Down here is where I'll initialize Firebase, so I'll put a comment saying initialize Firebase. And to initialize it, all you do is call firebase.initializeApp, and you pass in the config that you added to your API keys. So API keys.firebase config, and we'll save it, make sure that everything works over here. one final thing that I do just to be safe is I put an if statement, if not firebase.apps.length, and that checks if it has already been initialized. Sometimes in the past it has crashed if you try to initialize it twice. I'll save that. And now you should be able to use Firebase from within your application. Everything should be initialized and good to go. And last but not least, at this point I usually add my project to source control. I use Github, and that's what I'm going to show here. I highly recommend using that because it saves a backup of your code. It allows you to take snapshots. It's completely free to use, and it's very convenient. So to do that, you go over to github.com. You can create an account if you don't have one, and do create a new repository. So this one will be called Expo Firebase Starter. You can give it a description if you want, set it to public, and I usually like to add a git ignore, and what I do is I put, well, actually I don't do that. I'll show you how to do the git ignore later, and you can do a readme if you want. So click create repository, and it will create the repository for you. You can click this to copy the path, and I'll show you how to get it set up on your computer. So I've got that copied. I'll come back into this folder, and I'm going to make a temporary folder called Expo Firebase Starter Git, and I'll open a terminal there, and the command here is git clone and the path that you just copied. Click enter, and what that's doing is cloning the repository into this folder. So you can see it here. And then what I do after that is create the git ignore file. The way that I found that's easiest to do here is you cd into that folder. Hang on. So open a terminal up into this folder, and if you just type touch.gitignore, it will create the file, and then you can edit that. And it would be a good idea to put the node modules folder in there, as well as constants/API-keys.js. That way, what this is saying is don't store any of those files on Git. Node modules you don't want to do just because it's a huge folder, and this one you don't want to put in there probably because it's might have secret information in it. All right, so that's set up, and now I take these folders here, and I'm just going to move them into the Git folder, which is right here. And this is going to cause this to mess up probably. Or maybe I won't even do it. Okay, so that might be a little bit slow to do, so I'll pause the video and come back when all that's moved over. Okay, so I've got the files copied over, and I've got a terminal window open up in that folder. To move your files into source control, you need to type in 3 commands. The first one is git add star, and that adds all the files to the repository. The next one is git commit -m, and in quotes, a message about what the commit is. I'm going to type initial commit. And here it gives you a summary of all the files that will be added. The final command to push it to the repository is git push origin master. And as soon as you enter that, it will push your changes to the repository. And I will keep all of my code on my personal repository for you to look at as needed. Thanks, bye.